keeps to propose something, but we don't have a clear mapping of what we might be reusing and what we might be generating where and when. And we do need better coordination among the players, among the key stakeholders out there in the North Sea. We do need to have a better synchronization of these should I stay or should I go debate, because if you don't decommission, you might reuse, but if you cannot reuse and you don't decommission, you leave the environment polluted. And the law says that you have to remove that equipment. Incidentally, the estimated cost for the total decommissioning of the oil and gas infrastructure in the UKCS has been estimated at anything between 50 and 60 billion pounds. For offshore wind, there was an ARUP study in 2018 that for the then only 37 offshore wind farms estimated the decommissioning cost to be easily about 3.5 to 4 billion pounds. So if you imagine the escalation of the offshore wind, that's probably going to become comparable to oil and gas decommissioning in terms of costs. So we have to make sure that whoever is going to do things in the energy sector will have the money aside, maybe in escrow accounts, maybe in whatever accounts, in order to cover for the ultimate decommissioning liability. We don't want people to go bankrupt or close the business and go somewhere else without having fulfilled their decommissioning liabilities in anything, I repeat. And so this is where I think we've got lessons to learn from oil and gas, because the oil and gas industry is experiencing now the urgency of decommissioning. But anything else that we are starting today will face the commissioning challenges in 20, 30, 40 years down the line. So reusing is good, but there is no infinite reusing. Procrastination is not good. And I think with this, I just one final bullet point about taking a multivariate SWOT analysis of really what options are available for life extension. So I think I'm done with this, and I just wanted to say thank you for your attention. Thank you.
So once again, do we have any questions from the room? And if we do, can we get a microphone perhaps out to the audience? There's a lot in that presentation, wasn't there? Okay, there we go. Great, first one. This gentleman here.
So, is that working? Or? Yeah, okay. With the interconnector for offshore wind, is there a way of integrating that into the decommissioning plans of the North Sea?
As in powering the decommissioning operations, you mean, or?
So for offshore wind, they are looking for future build-outs to have joint interconnector infrastructure. Would that be beneficial to play more into like offshore green hydrogen sort of plants? Is there a way of connecting those up?
Yeah. So there are again many possible options moving forward. First one is that of just electrifying oil and gas operations. So imagine just continuing extracting the hydrocarbons, if that's allowed, but making sure that the extraction operations are net zero as much as possible by replacing diesels, etc., running on conventional fuels with clean electricity. That's the first option. And this is what Equinor has already been doing with one development, where they've built ad hoc, bespoke, an offshore wind development to power their platform. However, I should say that in that particular project, the electricity coming from the offshore wind development only covers for about 30% maximum of the total electricity demand of the platform. And also the economics look right in that case, because the platform is quite new and still has another 20 to 25 years ahead. There is, of course, all the option of bringing electricity together at the right interconnectors and to redistribute the electricity to the right use and direction. And this is precisely why there is an attention to whether we can do something cheaply or cheaper offshore rather than doing it onshore. So the debate is precisely about the distances. Shall I bring the electricity to shore, or shall I bring the electricity to even maybe a bespoke artificial island offshore? So we're talking about building now dedicated islands offshore to produce things and then to ship or redivert as required. We have to be careful about these islands things as well, and where they're going to be built, because there might be a tendency to want to have some of these infrastructures strategically at the geographical boundaries between countries, which then becomes an issue of emissions. They're yours, no, they're yours. No, you have them, no, you have them. So it's important that we keep an eye on this, I think. But thank you for the question, yes.
So we have these wells in the offshore, and then obviously, what do you feel is the geothermal potential for these wells, or do you think that's a viable option going forward?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we looked at them, and before us, other people looked at them, and there was a paper published in 2014 that was looking at the thermal potential of the water co-produced by oil and gas wells. If you're not familiar with it, when we produce hydrocarbons, because there is normally always an aquifer connected beneath or laterally, at some point we always start to co-produce water, and as the fields age, the water content can be as high as 98%, 99%. And so you're just after the remaining 2% or 1% of hydrocarbons. For as long as that little tiny amount is still economic, the operator will still continue producing. But why not using the thermal energy associated with all the vast amount of water that is coming to the wellhead warm enough? The warm enough can be easily in the range of 60, 80 degrees Celsius, sometimes if you're lucky in some places, even more. So there is definitely a geothermal potential. The question is, you are offshore in the middle of nowhere. You probably don't have end users wanting heat. You certainly don't have residential customers out there. You don't have offices. You don't have anything really requiring heat in large amounts. So the remaining question is whether you can translate the thermal energy into electricity by means of technologies such as organic Rankine cycles. And the answer is yes, it is possible. But how much electricity? And again, who needs electricity? Should you think about connecting to some of these strategic nodes where all the various electricity sources come together and then go to their final destiny? Or could you reuse the electricity to power your own oil and gas operations? So it's again electrification of the oil and gas operations by using the electricity from your own co-produced water or export of the electricity. But then the question is that competitive? So in the mixture of all this picture you've seen, what then becomes more competitive? To generate electricity from an existing oil and gas platform, or to create a brand new state-of-the-art offshore wind installation that is already designed since the beginning to just produce electricity, clean electricity? It's all down to how old your field is. If your field only has 2, 3, 4, 5 years of life left, you're not going to spend the capex of bringing in a new RC, retrofitting some of the equipment just for the remaining lifetime. So if your field is about to finish, it's probably too late to start thinking of something like that.
Thank you very much. And just another quick question about the embrittlement point you mentioned, about 30% of the existing pipeline as viable for hydrogen production, hydrogen transportation. If you're transporting that out to the obviously offshore, what sort of like we think about economically, which one's going to be more viable to have to repurpose all that infrastructure out to the North Sea, or just to build the wells onshore? What's preventing it just to go onshore, preventing having to build those pipelines?
Yeah. That is an excellent question, and that is what needs to be decided on a case-by-case basis. It's very likely that going offshore will just increase the costs, and this is where it's nice to go offshore if you can reuse infrastructure. And if you have the assurance that infrastructure will stay there, you don't have to rebuild it, you don't have to spend too much money in keeping it in good order. If not, if you have to start afresh, then probably onshore is making more sense for the hydrogen generation part. Thank you. And this is, I think, part of also that type of, I think one of you had a question about competition earlier on. It is all about defining those opportunities. So the number of depleted reservoirs is limited. We don't have an infinite number of depleted reservoirs. So we do have to decide whether we want to use them for CO2 storage or for hydrogen storage. At the moment, I don't know if you're aware, but the Oil and Gas Authority is the authority licensing exploration licenses for CCS and granting, oops, that's me, telling me that I'm done. So licensing, exploration licenses, and also possibly in the future, storage permits for CO2. At the moment, we don't have any authority giving any licenses whatsoever or anything to do with hydrogen. But even if you get the license for CCS, for CO2 storage, at the moment, the authority is asking you that you have a backup plan. So even if you're proposing to inject in saline aquifers, you need to have a backup plan to also have a depleted hydrocarbon field ready. And so you can see that already a priority is being given to CO2 projects. So we need to be, again, maybe screening out what remains that might be available for hydrogen storage, at least as far as depleted fields are concerned. The space in depleted fields is much smaller than what might be available in saline aquifers, but that's a different story because of different geological structure and uncertainty.
Thank you very much.
There's one at the back.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, are there any considerations or thoughts regarding converting, using green energy, hydrogen in the home, so therefore, or you can have stations around villages or towns whereby the conversion is done locally. So you have green energy coming in, it's converted locally, and then the hydrogen is used in the home or whatever.
Yeah, so definitely so. And I think there's a lot more of attention these days to smart local energy systems, SLES. And we already have an example of local hydrogen generation by electrolysis in Kiel campus in England. And so they've been able to connect the hydrogen to their own gas distribution system. And in fact, Kiel got the award for Sustainability University of the Year in 2021. So we would like to see a bit more of these local, so bottom-up rather than top-down approach. And yeah, so I can only say it is happening and it's desirable. Thank you. There was a question.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Are there any plans to store hydrogen onshore? You know, the big gasometers that we have still dotted about. Would they be suitable to store hydrogen in eventually?
Yeah, I do have a backup slide at the end if I can. So, thank you. If I can find it, yeah. So this is a map of the salt caverns versus depleted fields onshore in the UK. So definitely there is some potential, and it might be that some of these locations will be considered. There is an issue with public acceptance and readiness of the public to potentially be sitting on or living near a subsurface volume that is containing hydrogen, but we have certainly accepted over the years natural gas storage systems. So there is definitely potential. Right, I think we'll keep the rest for the Q&A otherwise.
Yeah, in terms of actually on the surface, do you think that's something which is going to be acceptable or technically possible? Pick up on those questions.
Oh, sorry, surface, apologies. I thought it was
like
a completely, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
yes. Well, again, we've done it for natural gas. I always go and teach at TU Berlin every year, and the whole campus is built where there was a large storage tank for gas. It's not being used at the moment, but it was part of the city, and we've got many other examples of these. I'm from Rome. We've got quite a few in some areas of Rome. So I would say yes, and it might be a good maybe starting point for some demonstrators where we're just demonstrating some components of the integration rather than focusing on the storability underground. And then if we can demonstrate that, then maybe we can focus on something else. And the beauty of that is that they could be quite easily decommissioned as well. But then it comes down to, again, the volumes that we need. I think it comes down to the conditions, so storage, depression, temperature conditions. There is an issue of HSC, generally speaking. So because of the flammability of methane and hydrogen is very similar. However, because hydrogen is lighter, it can migrate quite fast. And there have been some tests done on the direction of the flame when ignition starts. So the risks are really to do with the containment design. So hydrogen is not necessarily more dangerous than methane from that point of view. Thank you.
Okay, any more from the floor? No?
Okay,
You
thank
got
you.
away with that, Joy? All
Thank
right,
you.
All right, well, thanks again. Right, we're doing well for time. And Joy's presentation there and the final theme leads us very nicely onto the discussion we'll have after the break. So unless anyone's got any other dying questions for the panel, we can take something like a 10-minute break, and then we'll reconvene at, let's say, what, 3:05, something like that. Sorry, my maths, yeah, 3. My maths is bad. Good thing I'm not an engineer, isn't it? So 3 o'clock, thank you very much.
Thank you. There's, we don't have coffee or teas, but we've got some water in the room out there if anyone of you is thirsty. Thank you.
ready to go again. Wants to take his spot. Get yourself comfortable. And this is all about the fact that it's all right, us technical folk coming up and dreaming and even building things and finding the money to do so, but then we have to get public acceptance because all of this is done within a societal framework, and so this is always super interesting for us to hear about as for those of us who are designing some of these solutions, is to think about how this all fits in, and certainly I know one thing we often talk about in geoscience is that we do not communicate necessarily in an effective way with the public, and it's something I think about pretty much every day, I must say, on how we can do a better job at that. So this is a very timely discussion from Leslie Mabel from the Open University. All yours.
Hey, thanks very much, Glenn. My name is Leslie Mabin from the Open University, as the slide suggests. I'm going to speak for the final sort of structured talk that we have about hydrogen and its relation to society. I'm going to apologise in advance as well. Now, I seem to be allergic to the COP26 masks, so I've been sneezing all day and my nose is streaming. I assure you it's not COVID, but if I'm a bit stuffed up, that's what it is. There's something about this mask that my nose just doesn't agree with. So if I have a sneezing fit, you'll know what it is. So, as I said, I'm going to talk a bit about the society that this hydrogen fits into, and what we do with it, and what some of the concerns and considerations are around that, because it's really important to remember that when we talk about net zero energy, when we talk about 1.5 degrees, when we talk about all these new technologies, ultimately we're doing it by and for people, and the kind of energy solutions that we have reflect the kind of society that we want to live in. So this stuff is, well, I would say this because I'm a social scientist, but it's absolutely critical. If I can... hydrogen, whether one agrees with it, likes it or not, is going to be a really significant part of meeting the Paris Agreement. And the reason I say that is that last week I was in the blue zone at COP26. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that to point out that there are a lot of countries globally whose nationally determined contributions, whose sort of statements of what they're going to do to keep warming to as close to 1.5 as possible relies quite heavily on hydrogen. And this is a snazzy little model from the Japan National Pavilion, the Japanese pavilion, of a view from Panasonic of a carbon neutral society using hydrogen. And it's a wonderful display, and it's got lights that flash up, and it's got great visuals. It looks absolutely brilliant. It looks magnificent. And you would think, yes, this is brilliant. If we can make hydrogen, if we can store it properly, if we can store it securely and safely, this is going to get us to net zero, no problem, you would think. However, it's not without its contestations. So, as I say, there's a big emphasis on hydrogen from some countries in their climate commitments, and Japan is one, others being Canada, Australia and Chile. Now, with the possible exception of Japan, which is maybe a little bit different, there's a common factor for 3 of those countries, and that is that 3 of them at least have quite a heavy natural resource extraction component to their national economies, which means a lot of jobs and a lot of money that is tied up with workers in the extractive industries and the things that are produced that could be sold elsewhere. And in fact, I was at a side event, and the Canadian Minister for Energy Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, was speaking, and he actually explicitly said one of the reasons that Canada is so interested in hydrogen is that they've got this big workforce in oil and gas. I'm going to say more about this in a minute, that are very concerned about what meeting net zero means for their jobs, and that hydrogen is potentially something that can help to bridge that gap. Japan, similarly, is a country that has very little in the way of natural resources and limited opportunities for doing other forms of renewables. And so there's a big interest there on energy security and in hydrogen. But having said that, there's a lot of environmental non-governmental organisations, the Greta Thunbergs and the Friends of the Earths of this world, who are quite sceptical, in some cases outright hostile to hydrogen being part of the Paris Agreement and what countries do to get there, seeing hydrogen, particularly blue hydrogen, as cover for the fossil fuel industry to continue doing what they're doing. And as I say, that's the kind of thrust of what I'm going to speak about for the rest of this session. So maybe bring it a little bit closer to home. We are in Scotland, and hydrogen, again, is something that is being talked about as part of a number of challenges that we face. So, as well as climate change, we still also have the issue of the ongoing pandemic and what a recovery from COVID might look like. And so we had last year the advisory group on economic recovery they were commissioned by the Scottish Government to do a report on how we might, and I hate to use the Boris buzzword, but build back better, how we might do that in Scotland. And there's a big focus on diversity there and equality, and how we can prioritise what we would think of as people's well-being, so health and good quality of life and fair and decent work and all the rest. And indeed, hydrogen gets a mention in there, particularly when it's produced from linking to renewable sources, particularly from heating and transport. So it's on the radar, and whilst it's something that is being thought about at UK and indeed at Scottish Government levels, as well as in other parts of the world. So I'm going to come back to this this thing that was raised by the Canadian Energy Minister, because it quite struck the Natural Resources Minister. Sorry, it quite struck me that this idea that hydrogen might also have a role to play in dealing with workforces and places that have relied quite heavily on oil, gas, and indeed coal. And I want to speak a bit about this idea of a just transition that some of you might have heard of, some of you might not have. Other people might have kind of heard it being carried away and taken as a sort of buzzword that gets dropped in everywhere. But in essence, a just transition it's a response to climate change that leaves nobody behind. And this has sort of taken on a kind of bigger, wider meaning in recent years. But at the core of that is this idea that you want to make sure that people and the places who rely on activities that have a big carbon impact aren't left behind or aren't disadvantaged as a result of how we meet our climate responses. Because if you look around the world, there are a lot of examples of what can happen to people and places whose jobs are reliant on natural resources when those activities are no longer continued. I mean, the classic example, of course, is Detroit in the United States, when car manufacturing moved away and the city went bankrupt. There are other examples like the coal mining city of Yubari in Japan, which lost 90% of its population and went bankrupt after the mines closed. So, South Ayrshire as well, East and South Ayrshire in Scotland. These were not energy transitions that happened because of climate goals, but they illustrate, what happens when you remove that source of a livelihood. And that's why, there are a lot of people, trade unions, local governments, workers themselves, who've got quite legitimate concerns about what rapid and urgent climate change action means for their jobs and for the places that they live in. The Scottish Government recognises this as well, and this is why in 2019 a Just Transition Commission was set up in Scotland. So I'm a bit too close to the mic there. I sound like a firebrand trade union leader, so I'll step away a little bit. So the Scottish Government in 2019 set up a Just Transition Commission to address these big questions. Okay, how do we do rapid, urgent climate change action that's compatible with 1.5 degrees, but recognise that, we live in a country where there are people, places, where this transition has got the potential to disproportionately affect some people more than others. And so again, hydrogen gets a mention in there as well as a strategy to help the oil and gas industry to transition. Also interest in hydrogen for rural areas. And this is something that we don't hear so much about, but this is really, really important. So I live in Oban, and everyone's like, oh, that's miles away. Yes, it is miles away. The other side of that, though, is that if I want to drive anywhere, it's probably about 3 hours at least by car. It's not ideal for electric vehicles. It's not necessarily ideal for every form of renewable generation. It's not necessarily ideal for the kind of buildings that we have, don't necessarily always lend themselves well to heat pumps and things like that. So, there's interest in, well, are there places, especially rural places, that are kind of a bit off the map and that don't always get the attention they should in these discussions about what the role of hydrogen might be in helping this transition to happen. Orkney's somewhere where they're really thinking about this at the moment. And actually, just to pick up on the question at the end of the last talk about sort of local hydrogen production and use, again, this is something I learned last week at COP26. This is being trialled in Japan in a region called Yamanashi, which is actually just at the bottom of Mount Fuji. They're trying exactly this, the idea that you can make hydrogen locally and use it locally so that you're not transporting it huge distances. All of which is to say that, there is potential there for hydrogen to support the people in places that are at risk of being left behind. But, on the whole, there's not a great deal of mention of hydrogen in the Scottish Government's just transition activities to date. So there's still that question, what is the role of hydrogen going to be in a net zero Scotland? There's also, and again, this is what I said right at the start, there's also this big question about what does wider society think? So, non-governmental organisations, NGOs, a bit of jargon on the slide there. For a long time, a lot of the non-governmental organisations have been maybe ambivalent, neutral, cautious towards things like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. Recently, they've actually become a lot more open and a lot more hostile towards things like hydrogen, things like carbon capture and storage in a zero carbon society. And again, this is something we've seen a lot of this at COP26, a lot of really aggressive language around how net zero is not real zero and, calling hydrogen a false solution and things like this. And I think something we've got to all be kind of aware of as people from different disciplines and different sectors of society, we sometimes have this assumption that when we talk about public acceptance, we're talking about safety. We're talking about communicating the science to people so that, we hit them over the head with the science like a rolling pin, tell them it's safe, it's not going to blow up, and then they'll accept it. Actually, the issue that we've got is it's not so much about safety, but it's also about this perception, this view that producing hydrogen supports fossil fuel industries. And that's what a lot of these non-governmental organisations, that's the kind of messaging that's being put out. And it's a real issue, it's a real challenge. This is Richard Dixon, the head of Friends of the Earth Scotland, and he was talking, this was about carbon capture, but he also checks hydrogen in here as well. SNP colluding with oil industry chiefs who should be in jail. Exceedingly strong language there. And again, if you're talking about deploying hydrogen into society and getting broad buy-in from people with more kind of strong pro-environmental views and social justice views, there are a lot of organisations, a lot of institutions, a lot of groups out there who will look at the role of the oil and gas industry and would argue that based on oil and gas's track record to date in responding or not, as the case might be, to climate change, there is little to no reason why we should believe that they will do any better from now on in. Not saying I agree with those arguments entirely, but the reason I'm saying that is that we need to be aware of them. We need to be aware that those arguments are out there and that they get a lot of attention and a lot of traction. And there's a big movement a lot of people out there who potentially see some of the industries that might be involved in especially the storage of hydrogen that don't see these industries as having any place in a zero carbon world. And it's a big problem. Having said that though, you know, we do have, and again this goes back to the two talks that we saw before the break, we have a large North Sea oil industry in Scotland. We have a lot of people that work in that industry who, as I say, you know, have got very understandable and very legitimate concerns about what all this means for their jobs. And so a group of non-governmental organisations working together last year had released a report into the just transition in North Sea workers, and they've done a survey, a follow-up survey after. And what they found is, you know, there is a big desire for people working in the North Sea to retrain, you know, to use their skills, to maybe even potentially use infrastructure to do other things, but they don't necessarily have the money to do so. There isn't necessarily the funding available for people to go out and retrain and put themselves into college or back to uni and retrain to do other things. So hydrogen, again, if you look at some of this work, it gets a bit of a mention in there as a possible route to transitioning the oil and gas sector, but it's not something that perhaps gets as much attention as it should. As I say, we also have this underlying problem, this big elephant in the room, that you've got very influential chunks of society that will see anything involving certain companies or certain locations and will immediately come out and quite aggressively protest against it. A really big issue though, and a really, really tough thing, is when we think about hydrogen and we think about its deployment and we think about where we are in terms of the size and scale of projects that we have, we're probably a few years away from having a lot of things happening at large scale. We're probably a few years away from actually seeing stuff happening at big scale. But what oil and gas workers need is they need jobs and training now. They don't need things that are happening in 5-10 years' time. There are people who have jobs now who are needing to retrain and have other jobs now. Equally as well. So we think, okay, maybe if we are thinking about 10, 15 years down the road, we need, if we're going to have this infrastructure at scale, we're going to need a workforce to operate it. These people are going to be current students. They're going to be our university students. They're going to be our undergrads, our master's students, even high school students. The people that we're going to need to put this stuff into place and make it work are people who are going to be studying now. So, you know, so it's really important that when we think about how we design our curricula, our education platforms, that this kind of knowledge, that the appropriate skills and training are embedded in that right now, because we're going to need that in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, to get to where we need to be for net zero. So yeah, just in sum, you know, a lot of these arguments that are against hydrogen tend to kind of argue that hydrogen's an unnecessary distraction when electricity demand can be met via renewables and demand side reduction. Just as a little aside to what's on the slide, one of the things I think is something I want to investigate a little bit more if I can find some time to do it, is that the studies, the scientific studies that get picked up by the media and get a lot of attention and traction aren't necessarily always the ones that are the most robust or the most rigorous or are published in the highest ranking journals. That sounds like a bit of a snarky thing to say, but there's an issue there that the voices that are loudest in the sort of public debate and social media, the ones that get picked up by the press, don't tend to always account for a lot of the nuances and a lot of the difficulties. There's this argument as well that hydrogen with carbon capture unnecessarily perpetuates a fossil fuel economy and allows big polluters to continue operating. Again, you saw this week, Greta Thunberg was tweeting about this. There was a lot out there about, you know, fossil fuel companies being in COP26, and you know that gets a lot of traction. And as I said, that argument before about the kind of track record to date of climate action, and also the fact that we need jobs now and not necessarily in 5 to 10 years' time. So here's a timely and locally relevant tweet. This is not mine, this is from a couple of years ago, and it made me laugh an awful lot. And the reason I've put this up is because I think it actually reflects a big challenge we have around policy and governance for hydrogen. So this is somebody talking about Rangers and Celtic in Glasgow. And, you know, we have these two big football teams that have got very different, you know, cultures, contexts and all the rest. And people just oppose each other for anything. And this guy had said, and it made me laugh so much, he said, you know, Celtic could do an anti-global warming display, and the following week we'd have fossil fuels loyal flags flying at Rangers Stadium. I think we've got to think the same about hydrogen in a net zero society. It's very easy to end up being drawn into kind of false choice dichotomies that we either have everything being renewable and nice and clean, or we either have everything done by big oil and gas. That we tend to get drawn into these kind of false choice dichotomies. The media, I think, doesn't help with that. Social media doesn't help either, because, as I say, people who tend to take extreme positions tend to get amplified and tend to get a bigger audience. You know, there's a real need to think about, you know, how we get these more nuanced arguments across about how hydrogen can help us get to where we need to be in a fair and equitable and just way. So this is just a map. We did a few workshops earlier this year with our advisory board just to get their sense as industry experts about what we need now in the mid-2020s and what we need in the 2030s. And, you know, as you'll see, there's some stuff about society around there, but also, you know, there's a lot of other big challenges there about policy and governance and legislation. And again, I just want to highlight this because I'm aware I'm short of time, just to sort of flag up that, yes, the social side is important, but there's a lot of other things that kind of need to happen as well, that need a lot of different bits of research, science, academia, industry collaboration, all working together. So I'm just going to sum up then. And yeah, hydrogen, I would argue, just the one thing I want you to take away from it is that hydrogen, yeah, might have a big part to play in meeting our climate obligations globally, but it's got to fit in with the kind of society we want to create. And so this picture on the left here, this is another real-world hydrogen demonstrator. This is a new build area in Tokyo called Harumi Flag, and as you can maybe see from the kind of CGI creation, it's a pretty fancy place. You know, the heating and things and everything comes from hydrogen. That's not what we need hydrogen to do. You know, these are buildings and houses that are for the 1%. You know, maybe not even the 1%, maybe the 0.01% if you see the prices of housing. You know, we need hydrogen to fit within, you know, a kind of society we want to create more widely. And that means pathways to think about how we deploy it in the interests of the climate and the public and not fossil fuel and private sector profits. It means doing it in a way where it's actually going to be able to provide affordable energy to the people in the places that need it the most, and finding realistic and tangible ways in which it can support jobs and support a just transition for the people in places that currently rely on things that are not compatible with 1.5 degrees. So I will stop there before I get any more banging into the mic. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Marvellous. Okay, any takers for questions? There we go. Brilliant.
Thanks. Do you think the phrase just transition has been like hijacked by oil companies, because there's no, like, we saw in a graph earlier that the fossil fuel production was already almost crashed, and is only going to go lower because the fields are depleting. So, and nobody talked about just transition then. It's only now, so it's just to kind of get the last bit of life out of it.
I think that's a really fair point, and I would agree with that. I think you've actually seen in the last couple of years a lot more, some of the oil and gas majors starting to pick up on that language of a just transition, largely in the context of growing kind of awareness of the climate crisis, sort of saying, okay, if you shut us down now, you know, it's not us we're concerned about, look, it's our workers we're worried about. You know, and I think there's that, it can be misappropriated in bad faith quite easily by oil and gas majors as a means of justifying their continued existence. So I would say absolutely. I think it's a really useful phrase, because, as I say, you know, the people that are going to be hit hardest and first, the oil industry is not homogeneous. You know, it's not homogenous. You've got a lot of different people on different pay grades with different levels of qualifications, and it's the people who tend to be at the bottom of that pyramid that we need to be concerned about. But yeah, absolutely, it's a really good point that, you know, I think we need to be cautious about how this language is now being appropriated in bad faith.
I'll maybe just pick up on that. I was at a very interesting meeting the other evening with Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister of Australia. There was a debate going on there about the use of that terminology, because there was some speakers who was saying that that's the phrase we should use, and the European Union's using that phrase. They have their own fund using that terminology. He was saying if you're, you know, for instance, a mine worker in Australia, that's not what is going to appeal to you, it's jobs. So it's a contested phrase. I think it's fair enough to say, and loaded on both sides.
Why are Japan so open-minded to hydrogen? I understand they've been utilising it for a lot more years than us, but they're more open to its more widely available uses than in Europe. Why is that?
That's a very good question. I have a few thoughts as to why that is. One is that it's very difficult in Japan because of the geography and topography to do onshore renewables at any kind of scale. So you've got a lot of mountains that are covered in trees, which kind of rules out a lot of onshore wind, also rules out a lot of solar. Offshore wind is difficult because fishers have got a lot of political power, and if you want, essentially, if you want to do an offshore wind farm, you have to negotiate with fishing cooperatives almost on a site-by-site basis, which makes things really difficult and slows stuff down a lot. Plus, you also have, you know, typhoons and things which, you know, make quite unique design constraints. So part of that is that, you know, that through necessity, there's a lot of interest in hydrogen just because a lot of other net zero options are difficult to do at scale. With a slightly more cynical hat on, there are also a lot of large corporations within Japan who are very interested in hydrogen technology. You know, Toyota, Panasonic, as we saw there, you know, there's a lot of interest. Mitsubishi too. There's a lot of interest in R&D, and perhaps there's some kind of ambition down the line to be able to develop that in a way where it can then be sold to other parts of the world. So I would say maybe there's the kind of domestic industry, but then there's also the geographical constraints that mean that it's probably a more suitable option than some of the other things that we might entertain here.
Yeah, go ahead, please do. I was supposed to ask the panel.
Yeah, Leslie, you mentioned NGOs quite a lot, and you mentioned that NGOs are critical of blue hydrogen, green hydrogen. Are all NGOs of this opinion, or is it a bit more diverse when it comes to their opinion?
Oh, definitely a lot more diverse. And again, like, non-governmental organisations are not necessarily all the same. You find a lot of them, Bellona's a good example of one, the Pembina Institute in Canada's another, that are more pragmatic, I think, about hydrogen, about carbon capture, and maybe see, and E3G's another one as well, you know, in the UK and Europe, who maybe see their role as more about working between government with industry, between government, industry and civil society to kind of develop sort of pragmatic pathways to get us to where we need to go. They don't, as I say, they don't tend to grab the headlines in the same way. So their work tends to be more about, I guess, lobbying and kind of behind the scenes and diplomacy. The reason I kind of highlight and spotlight some of the ones that get a lot of visibility is because, you know, they do a lot of things that have the potential to get the attention of the press, and therefore to shape public opinion, and therefore to shape the opinion of voters. You know, and then that, particularly with our current government in the UK, that tends to be what they like. They like the opinion polls, and, you know, they tend to think about, you know, what voters are gonna go for. So absolutely, you know, there are a lot of other NGOs that you maybe don't get that same visibility that are also operating in that space and that are maybe looking for more pragmatic ways to produce hydrogen, and it's right that we don't sell those short.
Please do.
Question from me. I very much like what you said about nomenclature, that just transition maybe started in one way, but then took on several nuances, and I think that all those nuances are equally valid in many ways. And in connection to the comment that was made from the audience, there are still about 240,000 people working for the offshore oil and gas industry, and there is no comparison today with the level of employment in anything to do with renewable. So someone, again, has probably been procrastinating, but how would you relate the word just transition with fuel poverty? And I think it relates also to the last slide you mentioned here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely part of it. So, you know, traditionally when we thought about just transition, it tended to be quite narrowly focused on, like I was saying, jobs for people in extractive industries. It had its roots in, you know, in Canada and Australia and mining. And, you know, more recently it's kind of expanded into this bigger idea about, you know, who might be left behind, or, you know, ensuring that the way in which we respond to our climate imperatives doesn't, you know, create new inequalities or intensify existing ones. And so within that wider definition, fuel poverty absolutely, definitely does come into that. You know, that we think about how, you know, how we heat our homes, how we power our homes. There is a cost to that. And there's a cost to everything that we might do, whether it's hydrogen-fired boilers, whether it's heat pumps or whatever. There's a cost to all of those things. As you'll have seen recently, this was something that our dear Prime Minister took up his cause on about, you know, nobody's going to come and rip your boiler out of your house, and he's sort of tried to kind of politicise this issue. So I would say where the just transition comes in is thinking about exactly that. You know, where does the cost lie for decarbonising our homes? You know, where does the cost come from that? Who picks up that bill? And particularly, how do you ensure that those costs don't fall on consumers, particularly the poorest people who maybe have the least agency, the least ability to improve the efficiency of their homes and actually have the least capital to actually make some of these improvements. So, you know, a heat pump costs like 25 grand, I think. I mean, I know the costs are coming down, but unless you really know what you're doing, unless you've got the time and the knowledge to actually project manage installing it yourself, it's very difficult. So that's maybe something I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it would be useful to be able, you know, to understand, is hydrogen going to provide, you know, a more kind of cost-effective, or could it have a role in a more cost-effective way of heating our homes? And, you know, would that help with a just transition in this wider sense of kind of home energy and fuel poverty?
Questions are breaking out. It's great. You've got two. Yep.
I read recently about a project in Rotterdam where the Dutch were using a chemical process that was discovered almost 100 years ago, and they were combining hydrogen with CO2, and they were producing liquid hydrocarbons like kerosene and diesel and so on. And they were planning to use this to fly planes out of Schiphol. Now, if this is so, why are we not doing this? Would this not be a good way to use the hydrogen?
That's not something I have any knowledge of. Is it something any of our panellists know anything about?
I know a little bit about it. There's a company called Zero Avia who've just announced that they are going to be launching flights between the UK and the Netherlands, Rotterdam and Schiphol in Amsterdam, literally in the last couple of weeks, which is an extraordinary thing. They have a testbed plane in the UK at Cranfield University. So look them up. In fact, funnily enough, I tried to get them to speak at this event today, and didn't quite get hold of them in time. But yes, it's absolutely fascinating. There's all sorts of things popping up.
Well, it means we can keep flying, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the aviation angle is quite an interesting one, actually, because, you know, it looks like there's this debate we have with EV versus hydrogen is going to quite possibly divide aviation in two, in that short haul is probably going to go electric with some sort of green hydrogen element, and long haul most certainly is going to, well, unless there's something funky happens with synthetic fuels, the direction of travel looks like it's going to be hydrogen, because you simply can't carry the batteries from here to Australia. It's not going to happen.
You mentioned the project in Austria, which is quite a similar one.
Good afternoon. I'm a OU graduate too, so thanks to
Oh,
OU.
super. Great.
Yeah, thanks. With all this tension between NGOs and corporations, and also the technicalities around creating hydrogen and storing hydrogen, I wonder to what extent are the oil industry promoting the fact that they continue to use oil and gas, but negate that with carbon storage, like planting trees. I know the UK government have decreed that in the UK they're going to grow a Cardiff-sized forest in every region. So to what extent are the oil and gas companies pushing the plant more trees and don't destroy the forest so that they can continue to use oil and gas?
They are doing it an awful lot. So Shell in particular have got very much into this language of nature-based solutions, and about the planting of trees as ways of soaking up emissions too. You know, they've also been quite keen to promote some of the demonstration scale work they've done around carbon capture. I also saw at COP last week there was a banner that was up, and it said the oil and gas industry supports all 17 sustainable development goals, which seemed like a bit of a stretch to me. It seemed like a huge stretch. They are definitely doing these things. The issue as I see it, and as I said and I alluded to, is across some sections of society, across large swathes of society, there is absolutely no trust in some of these operators to act in the interests of the climate or the public, and it tends to be viewed with a great deal of scepticism and outright hostility. Particularly, there was a lot of pushback this week on the kind of nature-based solutions language when people saw the kind of institutions that were involved.
I just wanted to interject here, just to say that you use the word use. I mean, the oil and gas operators, they are actually not the end users of the hydrocarbons, they extract them. And there was a question earlier about transportation. That's where most of the hydrocarbons end up in. So it's important we don't get confused between the operations of extracting volumes of oil or gas with the actual actions that then use those hydrocarbons in such a way that they generate emissions when you burn them to fry. So I don't think that they are producing the oil to use in their own homes with the buckets and bringing home. So I think it's very important to also bring in the picture the role of the powers to be. It's not the commercial business that gives itself grant to operate in a certain area. It's not a commercial entity that gives itself the license to do exploration. It doesn't happen that way. So maybe someone needs to start deciding as to what is allowable, what is not. But for as long as it is allowable, these are not necessarily the entities that decide, unless someone tells them, go in that area and you can make business in the area. There was the CEO of Shell the other day in TV announcing in a very open way. I was almost surprised, but he said, for us, the investment in, for us as in them Shell, the investment in renewables is what we can do with the revenues from the oil and gas sale, because at the moment that's how they function. But anyone could make them stop by not purchasing the products. This is how companies go out of business. So no one is stopping any free human being from doing that. So I think, sorry if I just, I think the importance here is to indeed understand what is the true meaning of things. And I am concerned that there has been procrastination, there have been wills to keep these things going. And as the comment was said, there's been a will to keep these jobs, or keep going, knowing that maybe there was no tomorrow. Why drag it on so far? But it wasn't just the oil and gas companies doing it, in my personal view, and this is what annoys me a little bit, that I don't see the will to do the next step. And I'm not completely sure that there is one fix for everyone at country level or for the entire world. And this goes back to your question about diversification on local scale. So we need to start seeing the light in doing either hydrogen or then today, as you correctly pointed out, today. So we need the jobs today. And I don't think it's about level of salary of jobs. I think everyone needs to have a job, right? I think it's a human right to have a job and to bring the money home. So and we've seen this in mining when there was a catastrophic end at the end. And unfortunately, history is repeating itself. We're doing it again. We don't seem to be learning.
Well, I was going to say, it's all very well
With the microphone, if you,
what they were allowed to do, but at the same time, they spent hundreds of millions of pounds on lobbying people and misinforming the public so that the people didn't check, the laws didn't change. So it's kind of like a smoking executive not smoking, but then selling cigarettes.
No, I know now we enter into a probably different level of debate, but this is where, I don't know if you're hinting at corruption, if you don't want to say the word, but if that's what you have in mind, or something else, I suspect the same might be happening in all sorts of sectors whenever there is money to be made. My concern is, I've been working also in developing countries, and I've been traveling quite a lot with the United Nations. There is a major concern that the so-called resource curse can happen in anything else. It's not, don't just relate it to oil and gas. When there is a big money to be made and big exploitation to be made, that can happen. So maybe one word of caution is in guiding the transition of large corporates to something else, we need to make sure that it is a clean transition from all points of view, that we are not just shifting investment into doing operations in the same way but with a different product. That would be my personal concern. So corruption, resource curse, unequal, uneven distribution of money has happened in many things: diamonds, mining, oil and gas, everything. We just want to make sure it doesn't happen with any of the future solutions ahead. Just because they might be emitting less CO2, it doesn't mean that they should be triggering the same unintended consequences in any way. And this is part, I think, of what just transition means.
Exactly. I'll just add something to that. And I mean, I think you've hit on a really good thing there. So there is research, there's like, peer-reviewed research that has come out this year, last year as well, that has been looking at some of the disinformation and the doubt that was spread by oil and gas operators in the 80s, 90s. There's also a thing that, a lot of the NGOs want to see governments being a bit braver, and setting up a tougher regulatory environment. Also, some of the kind of intermediate users, airlines and things, there's a big difference between saying stop flying completely and artificially inducing demand by offering £10 flights to Prague and things like that. So there's a big complex environment there, which I think we need people to be a bit braver in setting that regulatory framework. Just to follow on from that point though, about just transitions, absolutely, because this is what a lot of the trade unions are now saying about offshore wind. Scotland is producing a lot of offshore wind. The jobs aren't necessarily coming to Scotland. The manufacturing jobs are not coming to Scotland. They're going to other countries, because our fabrication yards don't necessarily have the infrastructure, don't have the skills to take the work on. Whose fault is that? Well, that's national and government and devolved government, decades of not investing in updating them, and decades of not investing in bringing them up to standard. So if hydrogen's going to have a part in a just transition, that's another piece that I didn't have time to kind of really bring in here. How do we ensure that our domestic industries, our domestic fabrication yards, our power stations or whatever, are ready to take that work on, so that it is staying in the UK, and so that the places that are producing this energy for everybody are also getting the jobs and benefit from it?
Local content.
Exactly, local content.
I'd like to ask a question, actually representing an NGO that tries to be diplomatic in our approach. What we've been talking about here is the fact that there are solutions out there, technical solutions, which have got a cloud over them because of an association. And my federation represents tens of thousands of professionals who are just trying to offer solutions in a neutral way, right? How do we avoid getting stuck in this binary debate, and to say, listen, we're neutral on this. We just want to offer what's going to work for society. What would be a tip, or has anyone else got any suggestions for us?
That's a really good question, and I wish I knew the answer to it, because I think it would help a lot if I did. The only thing that I can kind of suggest is that I think, unfortunately, a lot of the political processes that we have at the moment, and a lot of the spaces in which discussion in society is undertaken, I mean, like Facebook and Twitter, aren't very conducive to, you know, constructive exchange of opinion. They're not very conducive to people being willing to take on new ideas and to be, to reflecting on what they learn and maybe, changing their opinion a bit on balance. So I think different kinds of deliberative ways of making decisions, things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, where people can hear about different pieces of evidence and then talk with each other and come to consensus on where we need to go. I think they've got a really important role to play. I mean, they're not just, we had a UK climate assembly, we had a Scottish climate assembly as well. You can also do them at smaller scales, at community level too, as a way of actually just kind of breaking down some of these adversarial ways of making decisions, and putting a technology or a basket of technologies out there and getting people to talk about them, I think can actually help to get past some of these either or false choices that we get drawn into.
Yeah, to be more of it us. Sorry, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
I think.
Just wait for the microphones to go. Yeah, there you go.
In order not to get stuck in between, because as a group, professional group, you want to avoid being stuck between the two elephants that are fighting. And I've said this to a few friends, and I said, there is a difference between science, keeping science, and the business model of science. University researchers and professionals, they are stuck with science, then allowing industries, political powers to transform that science into the business model of science. Now, over time, because researchers need the process of the business of science in order to advance research, which is, we need grants, we need research grants, we need endowment funds and all that. We tend to allow this particular other model of science enablers to determine what the science is actually doing. Now, if you must avoid being stuck between these two fights, just deliver the science, because the science is always true. 1 + 1 will remain 1 + 1. Even if they don't believe us now, in the next 50 years, it will still remain so. So if you deliver science and allow that science to be factual, not to allow the enablers of the business model of science to now use the media and spin the story. You hear, yes, 1 + 1 is fine. So why do we have to spin it over and over and allow others to take control of it? So my simple suggestion here is that let scientists be scientists, and if we have the capacity to translate what we have found into a business model, which is what is lacking in academic environment, it is going to help a lot. So, which means two things. One, science should remain science. Two, scientists, which is like us now, that are going to be new scientists following your footsteps and others, should be trained on the ability to, first of all, discover, and also, if we have the ability, if we have been trained well, we can also transfer what we have discovered into the business model, such that those who don't have the actual understanding of how this business is being done don't come and take the theory we have developed, take it into business model, and spin the story. So that is one way to stay, to survive in between the fight in the course of this journey.
And if any of you want to pick that up on that?
I love the comment because it sounds like total freedom in research. So obviously I think for all of us it means that hopefully tomorrow we don't have to write any more proposals for funding, and hopefully we don't have to raise money for our own PhDs and postdocs anymore, but that would be the total freedom of intellectual freedom. I can only agree with that. And I think you described it very nicely how sometimes there is this loophole where maybe an initial scientific finding triggers interest at higher levels, and then the higher levels strategically decide to channel some R&D money in that direction, which then becomes, almost as if you're already then deciding to exclusively invest research effort in those directions. What if tomorrow I want to do again research on olive oil and rather than hydrocarbon oil, for example? So you're right in what you're saying. Based on my personal experience, having traveled and worked in different countries as an academic too, the models do vary from country to country. So sometimes the pressure is greater in some places than in others. But all in all, yes, research needs funding, and we seldom have countries where the research is guaranteed. So you don't have infrastructure, personnel, students, postdocs that are guaranteed flat without you having to raise any money. But I actually raised this issue very recently with my own school, saying we are now presented with ethical challenges in research. And I was very clearly telling my school there are some topics for which there is lots of funding announced also by governmental councils, but I don't think I want to do research in that direction because I can already read between the lines what the expectation is for the outcome of that research, and maybe it's not something I'm prepared to supporting. And so sometimes we have to be strong enough and say, I'm not applying. And then am I not getting the promotion out of that? Probably not. Or am I not getting my postdocs funding? Probably not. But you'll keep on trying different doors. But you're absolutely right. We have to remain totally true and unbiased in research. And I don't always see that happening. Thank you. But I don't know if...
I'm going to add something quickly as well. And again, this is a bit of a rant, but it's, I think, important to raise. And that is the question of what gets funded. So again, peer-reviewed research, which came out last year. All the research that was funded on climate change, 2% of that went to the social sciences. You know, I know we don't need boats, we don't need planes, we don't need labs. You know, it tends to just be people and books and cups of coffee. Nonetheless, you know, that's a very small portion of the funding that went in. You look at the IPCC as well, and you look at the lead authors of the chapters, there is virtually nothing from the social sciences, yes, but it tends to be economics, political science, quantitative psychology. There's virtually nothing from the humanities, the arts. So, you know, as I say, climate change, hydrogen within that too, it's a social issue. You know, we're talking about society.
We're going to have to get back to hydrogen in a second, but I would just say, actually, we were both working on a project in the geothermal space about community funding of geothermal, and I can tell you, if you're in the science realm applying for EU funding, you need to have social scientists on board, and in fact, you may not get your project accepted. In fact, we have social psychologists on this, because we need to understand the community, if they're going to fund geothermal. And if you were to have a similar project on hydrogen, to bring things back to hydrogen, then you most certainly would have to do the same thing. So you're very welcome to join projects with us on this. Nicholas, you wanted to pick up?
I just want to say, well, that's very true, what you just said, and I think Leslie will probably agree with that. Because Leslie and I are working together on a hydrogen project.
Ah, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So we've opened it very wide from hydrogen. We're keeping Leslie on his feet because then he doesn't have to wear a mask, which is choking him to death.
I'll put my mask on and come and sit down then.
I've got some spare ones if you need them. So we've spread it pretty well, but was there anything back on hydrogen again from what you've heard that piques your curiosity, either from the technical angle or for how it fits into society, that you want to spin it back again? Excellent.
Bringing it back to hydrogen, and we've already appreciated the complexities of making it, storing it, and transporting it, and using it. Now, you have some countries that can do it well. For example, let's go to like China, in Nanjing, Shanghai, Beijing, all the motorbikes are electric. In India, New Delhi, they're all two-stroke, and they're throwing out a lot of stuff. So now, so it's almost like a social science question too. To what extent are these countries that, you know, like I pay a lot of money for my tax because I'm polluting my diesel car, and other countries are not taxing their citizens, and so they pollute as much as they like. So to what extent are we, countries are pitching themselves on a war footing whereby the atmosphere pollution has no boundaries, so a very pollutive country is affecting another country who's behaving themselves in that sense. So are there any tensions between countries that could be setting themselves up for conflict? That's what I'm trying to say.
Want me to say something? Can start? No. I'm just happy to probably start and open the floor for answers as well. It's an interesting question because it goes different ways. So sometimes you've been going to, for example, developing countries that don't want to miss out on the opportunity to follow the same curve that we have in other places, and maybe it goes back to, for example, natural resources, and the response normally is we waited for so long to finally attract investment, to finally get things ready to go. Now we want to catch the wave and let us produce these natural resources for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And then on the other hand, you've probably been hearing these days from COP26 that many developing countries are now also talking about a penalty fee to be paid to them for the climate change impacts they're already observing and experiencing, droughts, etc. How do you change that? I don't have the magical answer. I do not have the any close relationship to being able to decide for the world. But I think it is becoming an interesting game of passing the ball of the emissions all the time. The reason why I was picking up earlier on your expression use is because if I am, for example, producing oil and gas here, I'm extracting it as a fluid and I export it somewhere else, and then this somewhere else, this other country actually burns it and generates the emissions there, that's their problem. It doesn't count as my emissions. We had the Ministry for Energy from Colombia here 2 days ago. He was exactly in the same room, same seat, I think. And he was saying that Colombia as a country is already running 70% on renewable energy as its own consumption. So their own carbon footprint at the moment is very low, but they're still extracting and exporting a lot of coal, oil and gas. So again, that doesn't count as their own home emissions. That's probably, I don't know if you heard about it, the difference between consumption-based and production-based emissions calculations. And so when you do your LCA, when you do your life cycle analysis, mathematically speaking, you put your boundaries of your system and then you look at what is in, what is out, and the accumulation term. But if the outs or the ins don't count, you can easily play at games and make sure that your ins is absolutely fine and clean. And this is where we have to be careful about this clear definition of the boundaries. Let's take Scotland or take Glasgow. Glasgow wants to be carbon neutral by 2030 as a city. Yeah. Okay, that's the boundaries of Glasgow City Council. That's the boundary. What do we consider as coming in? What do we consider as going out? We are an academic institution. We've got students flying into Glasgow to come and take our own students. So they take international long-haul flights to come here. Do they count as university emissions or do they count as someone else's emissions? So it's not so straightforward. But we really have to be careful about these potential games on papers that could be done. So at the end of the day, either the world is going to net zero or you're absolutely right. We've just been moving green economy to never get to an ultimate net zero. I cannot close the sky, I cannot close the atmosphere, I cannot make Glasgow or the UK or any country in the world sealed from emissions from others. And we would like to see also if CO2 is to be removed from the atmosphere, we would really, really like to see priority given to taking out of the atmosphere the emissions that we already put out there. So that's why maybe there is the concern about triggering more emissions to then say, oh, but I'm getting another green product out of it. But we already have a surplus of emissions in the air. We already know. In fact, we have to go to negative net zero. Net zero will not save us. We have to go to negative net zero, where we take out from the atmosphere more than what we are emitting.
Okay, thank you. brings up an interesting question. We've been skirting around CCS as well, and you know, the question came early on about either or, and you know, are they in competition with each other for pore space? Do you find it easier when you're working on these topics, whether in a technical or social realm, to get them to be associated with each other or to detach them? Because this is a problem we have a lot with energy in general, right? You know, we need to look at this in the whole, but also we need to put out these subjects which are huge by themselves and are contested and you know, a lot of uncertainty. So I don't know, how do you feel in terms of managing them? I mean, they're big subjects by themselves.
Well, first of all, I was a bit surprised what you said, that we have limited depleted fields in the North Sea, for example, and that there will be a competition between the two of them, because our research shows that this will not be the case. There are so many depleted fields. There are so many opportunities for hydrogen storage and CO2 storage. I mean, we're currently discussing 2 major CO2 storage projects in the UK sector, which will probably cover a few gas fields, but still there's so much more space. I don't believe that this constant either-or mentality helps us to solve these questions.
I do have something to add to that, though, and those of you on the panel with more technical expertise might correct me here. So we've got a lot of capacity. We've got a lot of capacity in the North Sea to store things. What we need to do, though, pretty quickly, is get that characterised, which it maybe already is, get the permits issued for whatever you're going to put in, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's carbon dioxide, understand the infrastructure, understand the jobs. All that stuff takes time. So if there was some miraculous intervention at COP26 tonight, if countries got in a huddle and they came out the huddle and said, we are going to mandate CO2 storage and hydrogen storage tomorrow, and that's going to be in the Glasgow Agreement, how close would the UK be to actually being able to inject stuff? And so that's what I think we, from a kind of policy and governance side, is also important. We've got that capacity, but we need to make sure that the kind of regulations, the characterizations, the licenses and things like that are all in place. Because what you don't want is you don't want both CO2 ready to be injected and hydrogen ready to be stored, and then some kind of ethical competition for what's physically available. Is that a fair summation?
I think it's not a competition, should never be a competition, but you cannot necessarily use the same thing simultaneously. So what I was referring to earlier is that we need to have the structural systematic decision of which project needs to go on where and when. So I don't think we can use the same depleted field to store simultaneously CO2 and hydrogen. So we do need to make those decisions, I think. And at the moment we have seen exploration licenses granted, but we haven't got storage licenses issued yet. So I think, and the fact that we are having this debate probably confirms that the jury is to some extent still out there, and there are views about maybe the injectivity being lower than what has been claimed so far. The Bunter sandstone has actually been fracked accidentally in an attempt to prove injectivity for CO2 storage. We are going to present that at PETEX 2021 just in 2 weeks. So let's do it, let's prove it. Let's really try, as Leslie's probably indicating, let's try and do it, and let's not just try and do once again 1, 2, 3 demonstrators. We've got plenty of demonstrators in all sorts of things. How do we upscale? So, and we've got the clock ticking, so let's really get started with the full chain that Leslie, I think, is describing. Let's make sure that there is also the public acceptance of it before we impose it on the public from top down. And I don't know what the solution is going to be. It's just, we're talking about an energy transition. It's going to have to be a mix of solutions. That isn't the savior of the world that will fix it all. But we are apparently going to rely heavily on CCS as a whole to work. And so that is one thing to really reassure everyone about, that the CCS, and let's not put everything in the same pot. I mean, I know that everyone is not necessarily an expert of geosciences, but there are subsurfaces and subsurfaces, and there are things we know better than others, and some things we know less. So let's just put projects definitions. No, I don't want to book the whole subsurface. On a project-by-project basis, I'm a very boring traditional engineer. On a project-by-project basis, let's prove the feasibility of that project, how many jobs are to be attached to this project, for how long. You don't want to also trigger a business, and then after 2 projects, that business actually doesn't go on, because then we are creating another false supply chain with another false induct. And people need the assurance that if you are triggering new jobs, that those jobs will stay for a while. So that's I think, an important point.
Just one comment on the timing. For CO2 storage, Leslie, we both worked on the ACORN project. I think the plan was that the project could start injecting in 2022, 2023.
Yeah.
So the timing is, it's not in the future. It's, it would be recent. It would have been recent, unfortunately. In terms of hydrogen storage, we have storage sites. In the North Sea, we have them onshore. We could reuse them for hydrogen storage. The problem is the hydrogen. We need, currently blue hydrogen, green hydrogen is not produced on a massive scale. There we're just lacking of hydrogen.
And then there's a fundamental difference in that in hydrogen there is a value. So you've got a product that has a value. In CO2, we don't at the moment have anyone who would want to drill and inject for free to dispose of a waste product that is meant to remain down there permanently. So unless there is a taxation system, a policy system that finally closes the loop, so that the action of capturing, injecting the CO2 ultimately lets the operators make money, then the private sector will never do it.
I think it's sometimes a bit misleading that hydrogen storage and CO2 storage are always discussed in the same group, because they are actually different things. The CO2 storage industry has to look after very, very different aspects, like long-term aspect, thousands of years, millions of years. What's the CO2 going to do? Will it be safe over, at least 1,000 years or longer? Hydrogen storage is gas storage. We're looking for 30 years. We inject, we produce, we inject, we produce. It's a very, very different technology.
Tap opens and closes. Yeah.
We have a question I can see out in the...
Right. Send that microphone. Do you want to replace your masters? Are you all right?
All right.
You're all right.
It seems to be okay.
You're going to survive, okay.
Any thoughts on the ACORN project losing out funding to 2 English sites? If it was one of the more developed sites, then is it not partly controversial it didn't win any funding?
I'll stick my neck out. I'll stick my neck out and say, from the outside looking in, it would seem quite strange. And it's not the first time that this has happened. When, for those of you that have long memories and can remember back to Longanet, it's not the first time that funding for something that appeared to be, quite technically viable, but was located in Scotland, has been withdrawn. I'm not going to say any more than that, because I'm sure there were a number of factors that were taken into account in the decision of it. It's just to say this is the latest in a long line of these happening. It will be interesting to see if the other 2 projects come to fruition.
Nothing about conserving seats in the Midlands of England?
You could put that interpretation on it if you wanted. That's kind of getting outside my expertise. Certainly it is one interpretation.
Just one thing. As long as the 2 projects go ahead, I think we can all be very happy. I think that's important.
The atmosphere is the real winner.
Okay, any more? More questions? There we go, brilliant.
You talked about how one of the things you mentioned was who pays for it with the carbon storage thing. I was wondering if you had any idea on how you would go about solving that. Is that something that we would put on the fossil fuel companies, saying, well, you extracted this, so it's then your job to basically fund it and re-put the carbon back into Earth, or do you think that would just encourage them to move somewhere where they wouldn't be charged for it? Who's responsible for converting the oil and gas industries into storing hydrogen? You said that there would be cost to that, so whose job is it to pick up that bill?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. May I take it one step out to say that actually CO2, as you know, CO2 emissions is not only generated by oil and gas. We had here experts from the cement industry the other day. We had an event with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and we had the cement industry represented, and cement production is responsible for about 27% of CO2 emissions. So let's bring this in perspective. Every industry, every operation, every project that generates CO2 should really aim for net zero operations, so making sure that if they cannot generate their products without emitting CO2, that at least they should be capturing and storing that CO2 for as long as that product, say cement or oil or gas, continues to be desired and wanted by society, for use by society. So the question is, either you embed that cost, so there is a fee. Let's say I'm emitting, and what was done initially is a fee. So you emit, you get a penalty. However, that doesn't fix the environment, because I'm still, if I can afford it, I will still carry on emitting, and unfortunately that's not going to do anything good to the environment. So that's when there might be one step further, that is the obligation to not emit it. Even if you're producing it, you have to capture and sequester it. And that sequestration has to be forever, which obviously is the challenge, in that we won't be the judges of the forever success or not. So then that's what comes into, I think, discussions we were starting here. How do I then make it still be economic? So I then have to embed the additional cost of having to capture and store the CO2 myself. Is that cost still covered by the revenues? And in that, if it is a yes, at least it's just a matter of reduction of revenues. The other debate, obviously, is who should be paying this? Should it just be the organization that is producing the ultimate product? But what if the organization says, you know what, there is no money for me to be made anymore, I'll just close and I'm going. And then, okay, you have no CO2 emissions, but also you have no longer cement to keep on building. I mean, even in the UK, we are expanding like crazy with new developments every day. There's a key question on whether these new developments are sustainable, because they're actually even connected still to the gas grid, and if you connect them now to the gas grid, they will remain connected. So we go from, and I'm not an economist, so I should be the last person probably to speak, but there has been indicative values given to a ton of CO2. At European level, the average has been around 30 euros per ton of CO2, as in not the value, but that's what you get charged if you emit it, and likewise is what you have to turn into an action of storing it. So is it a taxation, is it a penalty, is it an embedded value? So maybe if there is a combination with a product like hydrogen, if there is a combination with still continued production of oil and gas, then I can absorb the cost of CCS. But then the question is, are we really going to no emissions? Or are we just, I think it's what Leslie was referring to, is there is the association of, are we using CCS to still store the emissions? I'm not denying it, but to indirectly maybe prompt even more emissions? And that's the fundamental question. But this is where I think has to all be scaled up from the project level. So I can only comment on whether it's right or wrong to do something when I see the full individual project. And then the question is that project approach scalable? Can you really fix the world? Even if it is a Ferrari of projects, even if it is just perfect, exactly what we want to do, but if it remains a one-off, and it's not going to save the world. And I don't want to see taxpayers paying for this one-off jewelry personally.
Any other answers? No? Okay. Any hands going up? Further questions? No?
You depressed them.
Okay, I have one geological hydrogen firework to throw in, and then maybe we can round off with a sense of 2050, just to take a prominent line in the sand, and ask where hydrogen's going to be. The geological hydrogen firework is natural hydrogen, and what we feel about that. And if we're having trouble with the issue of things coming at the subsurface, whether that's going to be even trickier to deal with, or does it, we have lots of uncertainty around it, but is it a contender? Anyone want to take that one on?
You volunteered.
There was a session on natural hydrogen earlier here, which I was on the train, unfortunately. So I don't know the outcome of that session. As far as I know, natural hydrogen is not a contender to artificially produced engineered hydrogen like blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, in terms of volume.
Right, so the volume thing might be the issue.
I know a lot of fields co-produce hydrogen, but the amount is just not very large. At least that's what I know.
Well, watch the recording of this morning if you want to learn more about that and the different aspects of it, because there is investment going in. But yeah, there's a big question over the volumes. Okay, so to round this off, 2050. Let's take a low case of a situation where hydrogen is really not being used. It was at a minimum, what does the world look like? What are the consequences of that? And then let's finish off on maybe a more optimistic or upper case where we're using hydrogen very effectively in society. What does that look like? What are the benefits or complications it presents? I don't know if you need a minute or two to think about that, and maybe the audience also can have a think about that. If any of you particularly have any views.
Right, so I suppose in a kind of higher case then, what I might like to see was that the final point I put up, hydrogen that's developed and used in a way that brings benefit first and foremost to the climate and also to society. And I think, as we said, in a theme that's been running across a lot of what we've talked about, a lot of the climate change debate tends to be in false choices, and it tends to be in either or. So I'd like to see in 2050 a world where, okay, we maybe have electric cars, but we might also realise that for places like Oban, we need fuel cell vehicles too, and we don't just have one kind of car. You know, where, okay, we have, some people have heat pumps, but we also accept that, you know, for retrofitting some buildings, that's not possible. And so hydrogen might have a role to play in the heat system, and we have an infrastructure that's set up to realise that. And that we also have I'd like to see a national company set up to oversee the storage and management of hydrogen, so that this is, you know, is where it is when it needs to be, and so that it's responsive to the requirements of the public in the first instance. So that's what I would like to see in my 2050 hydrogen world.
The National Hydrogen Company, isn't it?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, Nicholas.
I think hydrogen is one of the important tools for the future, especially the storage of hydrogen, because we will have low carbon energy storage, which is, I think, important. As I said before, most of our energy storage is carbon-based. If we want to decarbonize, we have to decarbonize storage as well. For me, the big question is whether hydrogen, if it kicks off, for example, in the UK, in Europe, in Japan, in other countries, how easily will this be transferable to poorer countries in the future? Because it is high, part of it is high-end technology. So yeah, that's, for me, the unknown.
Joy.
Interesting question. I think I'll respond in the same way I responded earlier to another question. I want to see an energy mix. So if hydrogen is to be part of it, that's great. And I want to see the different, my city, my town, my village. I'm from a national park in Italy, and so I don't want to see the nature of our park damaged ever any further. I don't want to see big solar panels coming on the park. I don't want to see the communities worried about maybe gas being drilled into, and we had gas fields nearby, and because we are an area suffering from natural earthquakes, those developments were stopped back in the 60s because of the risk of exploration of hydrocarbons in an area where you can have an earthquake and therefore uncontrolled release of hydrocarbons. So I'm always challenged to the real problem on the ground, the one little scale, the me scale. So can I retrofit my house now or tomorrow? I don't want to wait until 2030. Should I start preparing now with insulation? Should I start preparing? Is there any action I can do myself? And I'm missing personally as a citizen, I'm missing the guidance on what I should be. I'm here predicating, as an academic with a big picture for whatever, but I go home and I ask myself this question: what can I do now to make my house, my life greener? If I'm still flying, can I stop flying probably not at the moment. I don't see an alternative. And if I feel motion sick on trains, as I do, what do I do? Do I just keep feeling terrible? I do maybe, but I cannot travel by train. I cannot work on a train. So what do you do when you've got these things, and how do we make sure that we really do SDG 7, which is clean, affordable energy for all? And I go to places in developing countries where women are still inhaling the fumes of burning pure coal in their kitchens to cook, and there is no electricity. And I've been in Ethiopia talking about geothermal developments where there have been large banking investment for projects, and the local communities had been easily convinced to offer the ground for development in exchange for hot water on a daily basis. So these are those injustices which I think need to be probably given some attention before we think of a top-down approach that can save the world. But we need to think about our daily, what about this campus? How can I make this campus be greener? I cannot stop the way it is now. But can we be realistic about a pathway? Can we really develop a plan? That's what I do tomorrow, in 6 months, in 1 year, but have a plan, have a trajectory. We seem to be continuously waiting on these top-down policies, because without incentives, without renewable heat incentives, we've got probably the hands tied at small level. So the question is, how do we bring together technical feasibility at given scales to technical feasibility of different solutions everywhere, to those solutions being affordable without introducing injustices? So we really have to think about a mix. For me, if I can go to New Zealand and use geothermal energy, excellent, let's do it. Maybe we don't even have to prioritize hydrogen if there is already plenty of electricity. I was in Costa Rica, they've got so many volcanoes, so much wonderful geothermal energy, they're not even using it because they're already running 98%, 99%, 100% on clean electricity. They don't know what to do, and there is no export line to export that electricity. So why are we not prioritizing these easy opportunities? Maybe we can just run a nice cable between Central America, North America, and South America. So sometimes there is the obvious solution. There are places where heat pumps work. We've got a recently installed reverse hose heat pump at the Queen's Quay development along the Clyde Bank. That's working, and it's already feeding a local district, a local development. So there is the so-called low-hanging fruit that needs to happen now. So we're sometimes making the problem bigger when there is already technology ready, there are already business models ready for things to happen now. That's my personal view.
Big messages come from COP. We've got solutions. They just need the finance and planning. The bigger the thing is, the longer the planning timeline, of course. It can be 10 years or more in some cases. But maybe to go back to this original headline, red herring or silver bullet, well, it's probably neither. But it's going to work in certain places, and we've got to figure out how to do it in a green way, right? And to look at these things, like you might say, in a half full glass. We've got things we can do. We need to make sure that they're appropriate, but we're ready to provide solutions and to work with society for everyone's benefit on this topic. And it's wonderful we've been able to integrate several other solutions as well into this debate, which is always wonderful. CCS, geothermal as well. All right, well, I just want to genuinely say you have been an absolutely amazing audience. In the room here, there's been a non-stop stream of extremely well-informed questions that have really made this event really special and exactly what we hope for. So we want to thank you for coming out today. And with that, thank our panelists, Leslie, who probably needs to take off his mask very soon, Nicholas and Joy, and of course for the University of Glasgow for hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you.